I'll tell you about myself. I'm Australian. I come from British, Irish stock, but I consider myself something of a citizen of the world. I identify politically with the Republican and Indigenous sovereignty movements in my country. But more than Australian, I'm a proud Sydney-sider. I am married. My son's American. I'm an engineer. I'm a trained engineer. I'm a professional analyst. I'm an employee of Constellation Research. I'm a Qantas frequent flyer. I'm an old friend of Chris Meyer. And for my sins, I'm a Collingwood football supporter. I'm all of these things, and as the American poet Walt Whitman said, I am large, I contain multitudes. So I'm talking about the human experience of identity, okay? In real life, we know that identity is organic, it's ambiguous. I said a bunch of things there that you may not agree with, but you would have known exactly and with some precision what I was talking about. So we've got personal identities, we've got cultural identities, we play games, we have guises. Some of us mix work and pleasure, and some of us are really, really careful not to mix work and pleasure. We've got multiple personalities. But when we went online, when we made the analog to digital conversion of identity, we have really screwed it up. Digital identity is mathematical, it's precise, it doesn't mix properly, and when you do mix it, you just can't unscramble the egg. So today I want to talk about metaphors and where the identirati, this identity movement, have made some colossal missteps. So it's well known that most identity fraud and most internet fraud today relates to weaknesses in authentication. And I'm not going to rehash all of that. We know what identity fraud is all about. The guts of identity fraud is that digital data is too easy to replay, too easy to counterfeit, too easy to abuse and take over. Our responses to identity theft to date have been really, really crude. We take digital identities, weak as they are, and we layer more and more personal information on top of them to augment them. We add CVVs, we add the mother's maiden name, we add shared secrets and knowledge-based authentication, and all we're doing is piling up more personal data that in turn gets stolen and abused. Exactly. It's an insane vicious cycle. So for more than 15 years, the identity management industry has grown up around these problems, and they've come up with some really pretty kind of grandiose objectives to deal with identity. And they're trying to do many, many things at once. We're trying to improve security, we're trying to improve privacy, we are trying to reduce identification costs and identification barriers, we're trying to reduce friction, and the utopia of identity is to produce stranger-to-stranger e-business, this idea that you could trust somebody completely through ones and zeros online and then have some sort of experience with them that you're not going to have in real life. At this point, I always go back to the old Italian proverb that it's nice to trust, but it's much better not to. And I think we as humans know this. We know that there's a difference between technology and trust, and we know that trust is not always actually the objective. So why is identity so hard online? What we've forgotten in the technology discourse is that identity is a key to risk management. We only identify people in order to manage the risk that we're dealing with the wrong person in business. Different transactions carry different risks, and different transactions therefore drive different identification protocols. In other words, identities have evolved over time to suit a great variety of purposes. Now, I think if Charles Darwin was reincarnated and had a look at identity today, the question he would ask is, what should we do about this thing? The first thing that Darwin would ask is, how did we get to this point? Why is there so much identity? Why has identity speciated to be so rich? So we need to pay much more close attention to the ecology of risk and identity, and I love the way that Chris set the scene with ecological points this morning. Instead of looking at why, technologists have jumped straight in and allowed their own fairly simplistic intuitions about identity dominate the identity management industry. So for example, they've had a futile and very utopian search for the electronic passport, thinking that some sort of electronic gadget would give you international access to all things online, forgetting that passports don't work that way. It's curious that the word passport does not mean, in real life, what the engineer thinks it means online. Because in real life, a passport's not going to get you into all countries. You're going to need a visa. I mean, it pains me to even state the bleeding obvious, but you need a visa. You need to convince the identity. You need to convince the customs person at the gate that you've got a legitimate reason to make you visit. And some passports, of course, in fact, have the opposite effect. Some passports will actually stop you from going into some countries. So the passport's not what it seems. Beyond that, technologists in general have had some really strange intuitions about identity, none stranger than Mark Zuckerberg, who in 2010 said that he thought that trying to have multiple identities, quote, shows a lack of integrity. Now, of course, Zuckerberg was coming from a position of his real names policy, where he had a commercial interest in forcing people to use not a pseudonym. But look, all of these grand attempts at single grand identities have failed. In the 1990s, we had big certification authorities that would try to produce general purpose certificates that would get you into all business. It turns out that the general purpose identity has so much fine print and so many liability exclusions that it turns out to be completely useless. Now, the dominant idea in identity is federated identity. It again is this intuition that if you've gone to all of the bother of getting yourself identified with one service provider, then you should be able to reuse that identity everywhere else. It's easier said than done. And the problem is that the federated identity paradigm ignores evolution. It ignores the fact that we've got different identities for a reason. So taking, talk about metaphors, but I mean this literally. Taking an identity issued by a bank and using it to access a government is exactly the same as taking a saltwater fish and dropping it into a freshwater pond, because these things have evolved for different environments. And to that extent, diversity in identity is strength. So the digital identity challenge needs to be reframed. We need to go back to basics, which is, what do I need to know about somebody to deal with them online? And it's not their identity, it's not who they are, it's usually what they are. You know, if I'm trying to do some shopping, the merchant wants to know my credit card number, that's all they need to know. If I'm trying to access my work intranet, my employee number is what I need to know. If I'm a patient trying to access my personal controlled health record, then what matters is my health ID. So we're finding now that identity engineers, having messed around with the abstract for so long, they're now dropping into the matter of concrete attributes and trying to forget about abstract identity. Now, everyone, from banks to governments to big private sector consortia and standards bodies, are working on what we call trust frameworks. And I want to close my little opening remarks by suggesting that we need to shift the agenda of trust frameworks. I suggest that the trust framework architects need to forget about identity altogether and focus on attributes. What do you really need to know about somebody to do business? We should be leveraging modern, cryptographically sophisticated devices. I had to leave my phone behind, but your smartphone and your wearables to contain collections of verified attributes. And above all, we, identity people, need to stop stuffing around with the way that people do business. We need to stop interfering with the way that businesses manage risk. We need to allow them to preserve the relationships that they have with their stakeholders and instead give them tools that allow them to exchange verified attributes. Now, I don't give up trust altogether, because of course trust is a word that we have to use in human discourse. So when I talk about my predictions, I've got two. I predict that at some point we're going to come to our senses and ban smart thermostats from nuclear reactor control rooms. We talk about trust. I don't trust that the software in a Nest is going to behave itself and not reach out and spread malware. But the second prediction is that I think that, and I want to talk about privacy for a minute, and maybe we'll talk about privacy some more. I came to privacy because it's the inverse of identity. Identity is what do you need to know about somebody to do business with them. Privacy is what do you not need to know about somebody and still be able to deal with them. Data mining is going to drive some institutional and some supply chain reforms in the same way that mineral mining did in the 1850s. The 1850s gold rush led to enormous changes, and I see the same thing happening with data mining. I think what's going to happen is that we're going to start to see data as a special type of resource, and we're going to regulate it. As intangible as it is, and technologists can't deal with the idea that public data is actually a resource, and it should be encumbered. There's plenty of public resources that are encumbered, like electromagnetic spectrum, like copyright, And the technologists are just going to have to get over their intuitions and be brought to heel and start to see some constraints being applied in what has otherwise been a free-for-all.